Hello and welcome to Dialogue. As with other countries, China is preparing to engage with a new government in Washington. We'll take this opportunity to examine China-U.S. ties, arguably the world's most important relationship today. While Washington often frames the ties as one of a strategic competition, Beijing has consistently sought cooperation based on mutual respect. Why does China view the relationship differently? How will China navigate an increasingly hostile U.S.? And what lessons can both nations draw from the past to prevent a new Cold War for the sake of global peace and stability? Join us for today's discussion live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Dr. Shao Yuqun, Senior Research Fellow at the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies, Professor Zha Daojiong from Peking University, and Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome to Dialogue. So, Yuqun, I will start with you. First, how do you characterize the past decades of relations, compared to the most recent years of the Biden administration and perhaps the first Trump administration between the two countries,
Hello, Qinduo. First of all, thank you very much for having me today. I think the relationship between China and the United States during the past decades before the first Trump administration, I would say it's a cooperative engagement. Bilaterally, China and the U.S. had very close trade and economic relations. And also people-to-people exchanges were very active. And also in the regional level and also on the global level, the two big countries had a lot of cooperation on the issues that have major applications. And for example, during the Obama administration, the male-to-male relation between China and the United States was very positive and active. And then the two countries had a very close operation, for example, in countering Ebola in Africa. So these kind of interactions had made a lot of positive implications for both the Asia-Pacific region and the whole world. But actually, I would say started from the end of the second Obama administration, Washington had changed its strategic view regarding on China. And then in the first Trump administration and continue with the Biden administration, Washington has changed its overall strategic understanding and policy towards China.
Well, with that kind of a change, Professor Zha, until last year, let's say fast forward to the end of last year, the summit meeting between Chinese and U.S. leaders in Lima last November. So President Xi talked about basically 7 very important points in handling the bilateral relationship. For example, he mentioned about, it's very important to have a correct strategic perception. So if he emphasized such a point, obviously, people would assume there's something we need to do about this strategic perception. How do you look at this?
The notion of strategic perception is for definition by various speakers or the governments where they represent. And furthermore, that needs to have a buy-in or has to be translated into particular policies. I would think, according to my understanding, the notion of strategic perception here in China is that the future is wide open and, nations rise and fall, and the primary responsibility of a nation is to take care of its domestic business and on that basis relate to everyone available and comfortable abroad. But then the same wording, whether it's strategic competition or strategic perception in the U.S. context, would come with a hierarchy, which also puts one entity, in this case, the United States, as the sort of ordained or a top position that's not going to be challenged. Should there is a rise challenge the perception, then would be America's duty to respond, by which is the code word for saying let's defeat the next on the list. So yeah, what I'm really trying to say is that a lot of times we have communication, we talk to each other, meaning between the Chinese and Americans or Chinese and some other foreigners, but we have to be cognizant of the differences in understanding the same vocabulary.
The same vocabulary, but at the same time, Baocheng, I want to have your, opinion here. China and the U.S. seems to view their relationship differently. As I said at the beginning of the show, U.S. would say China is, the number one challenge to their position or the future development. But China has been basically calling for cooperation, mutual respect, equal footing, etc. Why is there such a different views?
Well, there has been vast difference in histories, culture, and political regime. And so it is really a reality that is presented. And as the two big nations, two biggest economies, they have to recognize the coexistence and also the shared planet they all live on. And more importantly, it is really the interdependence, both on economic, technological, and cultural front, can never be reshaken or eliminated by any political maneuverability. So this is really the fact that all of them have realized, and the U.S. used to have a sort of fantasy that they could really introduce a template around the world so that they're understood democracy and freedom can be copied, duplicated anywhere in the world. But over the years, there has been very few success stories, and not to mention China. So therefore, President Xi also raised the point that there needs to be respect of the reality of the differences, but it does not really there to undermine the common ground for successful cooperation, not only to bring benefit to both of the economies and both of their peoples, but also they have a responsibility to contribute to the public goods in the world affairs in terms of climate change, health issues, educational issues, etc. So such sort of difference can also be really guardrailed to be able to allow better room for further cooperation. And this is really the wish of their all constituencies. So this is something that's being politicized or even weaponized, and this shall not really work.
Well, Yuqun, of course, the presidency also mentioned about match words with actions. I would dare to say, basically, he's critical of the U.S. side of there are words, but somehow it's not met with actions. Is that the case?
Yeah, of course. If we talk about, for example, President Biden had repeatedly said that the United States does not support Taiwan independence, right? But if we look at the real policy by the Biden administration, since the DPP authority now in Taiwan, they have adopted a Taiwan independence policy. And at the same time, the Biden administration has given a lot of support to the DPP authorities, not economically, but also militarily. So every time President Biden and also senior officials from the Biden administration said that the United States does not support Taiwan independence, most of the people here don't believe them. And because the words doesn't match with the actions, that's what President Xi Jinping was talking about.
And also, Professor Zha, treat each other as equals. If you look at the Chinese principle, Chinese diplomatic principle, they often basically stress this point, equal footing, equality between different countries, whether they are large or small, strong, probably or weak. But why is it so difficult for countries in dealing with each other, dealing with the U.S. in particular, to be treated equal?
Well, equality is certainly one of the values in everyday life, and which also applies to state-to-state relations. But I'm not trying to take a position on either, the Chinese assessment of whether or not the U.S. is treating China equally. And then there is the question of equal to what, equal to whom. And out of that, you do have a legitimate question about equality. I mean, equity. In other words, in terms of equity, the level of treatment you get is premised upon the level of contribution you make. But then, we can go on and on in terms of contribution, and you have to assess capacity. You have to assess the contributing parties' expectation of returns.
Well,
so
if
what
they
I'm
are
really
sovereign
trying to
states,
get at
they
here,
are equal, right?
Yes, that is a principle in international law. It's a principle of the international norms. But then what we are really having is one party's assessment of the level of treatment it affords the other, or the other is entitled to get, is different. And there are many countries, let's be frank and honest, although we are talking about China and the United States, there are voices outside from third parties that may raise questions about equality in terms of Chinese policy as well. So especially at this time of transition in the U.S. leadership, we need to, it will be in China's interest to be more, at least flexible as a tactic, but also in a matter of principle, not just to assign blame to one party. We have to accept that equality is a sound principle, but nevertheless, there are different understandings of how that materializes.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we look at the most sensitive issues, let's say so-called red lines, I mean, the Chinese side has made it very clear. For example, of course, we mentioned the Taiwan question. This is about sovereignty, territorial integrity. But at the same time, Baocheng, the Chinese side also mentioned, let's say, China's path and system. Why is it a red line for China?
Well, Taiwan, of course, is totally a domestic affairs. And as you mentioned, this is really the sovereign issue that never allows any compromise. And with regard to the China road and China's right for development, because Chinese know best of what road they need to take to bring its own industrialization, to bring its own urbanization, hence the Chinese-style modernization. And the fact that over the years, through trial and error, since the founding of the People's Republic, we more or less have discovered the right way that is most suitable for China to grow. And so outsiders may really make any comments. They have all the freedom. However, the decision are really in the hands of the Chinese people and their elected leadership. So, for example, in dealing with the Chinese socialist market economy, there are more liberals who say, okay, you got to have full market economy. And then what about the equity, as Professor Zha has really been discussing about? So how to take care for those who are not very privileged, and how to make sure that the national strategy will be addressed in the Chinese perception. And hence, the respect becomes utterly important, because the world is beautiful simply because it is very diverse. Mm-hmm. A uniform template applicable to every country is totally a fantasy. Mm-hmm. And I think the U.S. has really realized that. However, they do not really show the appreciation for such sort of level of inclusivity and the respect of such diversity. So, yeah, I think every nation have their own ethnocentric perspective. And we also say that some of the Chinese groups may also have a totally different view over what the U.S. might really highly value. So this is really the difference. But again, we need really to have the wisdom and the capacity to set aside of such differences and continue to engage for constructive outcome, not only for the benefit of two countries, but also for the world.
Yeah, diversity should be respected there. And also, Yuqun, here, democracy and human rights. Are we talking about this, let's say, political system or ideology that should be respected? Countries have different practices there?
Yeah, actually, democracy and human rights are the international ideals and norms that every country respect. But just as Professor Liu said, that actually every country has different situation. It's very diverse. So before the first Trump administration, actually China and the U.S. had a lot of rounds of human rights dialogue. And these dialogues have been quite effective to communicate with each other and to improve the human rights conditions in both countries. But then starting from 2017, this kind of a mechanism had stopped. So that's why President Xi, when he said about those 7 points, there was one thing that we have to improve. We have to have more dialogues and communications, and have so that we can have cooperation. But these days in Washington, there are some people, they are very how should I say, they're very they dislike any kind of a dialogue with Beijing and with China, and they think it's a kind of a waste of time. And China has, the so-called China has used the time of a dialogue to fasten our development and try to catch up with the United States. So this kind of perception and mindset has been really negative in our bilateral relations.
Well, I want to add something, the latest, in terms of democracy and human rights, China's path and system development there. I'm not sure if you are following this, what's happened over the Red Note, Xiaohongshu, there's a flood of U.S. users. When they discover the ordinary Chinese people's lives, one of the themes they are surprised at the discovery is that, the Chinese people, regular Chinese folks, they can afford their lifestyle with one job. Basically, you can sustain daily, the fruit, the vegetables, etc. That's something we take it for granted. Of course, people have different views about the human rights, but that's probably the basic rights to life. That's good for the people dialogue and communication, Yuqun?
Yeah, of course. From the Red Note saying that at least we can have 2 takeaways. First of all, is the ordinary American people, their views, their perception of China has been twisted by the mainstream media in the United States. What they have got from the Red Note cannot be got from the mainstream U.S. medias, right? This is the first thing. The second is the ordinary people's right to develop, to improve their daily lives is the basic human rights. And China has made a lot of progress in the past decades on this front. And the United States has not appreciated it as much as they can. Actually, it's a big contribution to the whole world. It's not only for China itself, it's for the whole world. And the U.S. has, because of they don't have the so-called correct strategic perception about China. So they would use those different angle to look at China's development style and the past.
Professor Zha.
I would also like to add an anecdote that, to show that the human rights is pretty much dependent on the level of development. A couple of months ago, I was in Geneva. I talked with my great friend, a professor, and he said that when he was in his teenagehood, his responsibility was to cut newspapers for the whole family to use as toilet paper. And so think of the China. Even 30 years ago, we didn't really have most people do not have even access to tissues and toilet paper. And so look at what China's lifestyle now. And then China used to work when I was a young teacher. We used to work 6 days in a week. Now we have, at par with that of the United States. So therefore, there should be a dynamic view over the level of progress China has been making, and also the fact that China has been supporting the global South. And many of them are really having something that's even worse a situation. But how do you treat such an issue? If you're not there to help, just shut up and also, give them a best blessing instead of simply pointing fingers into the existing conditions people have to live in.
Well, another point, one of the 4 red lines is China's development right. Professor Zha, what does that mean?
Well, I would think of at least three or four indicators of a right to development. Number one, that's obvious, it's technology. Yes, every technology, especially the more advanced ones today, can have dual use, but technology first and foremost serves everyday human interest and aggregate economic growth. Wars are very infrequent occurrences in human life. And second, the right to development, it has to do with the access to trade and to materials. And now many would say, well, what are the Chinese complaining about? China is already one of the largest trading nations. This has to do with the issue of a right for China, because you have many countries, not just the United States, saying, well, this trade is not really but the principle somehow of comparative advantage has to give way to worries about reliance or worries about influence. They don't really call a spade in terms of the product that's being served and or being made in terms of the technical quality or in terms of the monetary value. A third element of development has to do with right to development competition. I wouldn't say competition. I think it's you have a business element of competition, but the spirit of that is cooperation between China and the third country. You have a kind of with us or against us demand from not just the United States, but also some other G7 countries, or even to a lesser degree, the EU, telling a third country, say, hey, you can't really work with the Chinese, you have to work with us. And that's to the detriment of China's pursuit of development. The last but not least has to do with some of the global commons issues, such as climate change, addressing carbon emissions. We have had a long history of argument over the principle of equality or equity in terms of a contribution. The U.S. in this particular case is a bit of wavering back and forth in terms of its commitment, but they never really had a let up on demanding other countries, including China, to quote unquote live up to its obligations. And then viewed from China, the U.S. is not really doing its own share, but at the same time, its demands comes at an unfair cost to Chinese pursuit of growth. Without growth, how can you live up to any kind of commitment, whether it's climate change or something else? I would think that right to development covers at least those 4 areas.
Well, Yuqun, if you look at, earlier we talked about the different views of this most important relationship in the world, where the U.S. side would call China a systematic rival, the Chinese side is seeking, cooperation. At his farewell speech, President Biden talked about how tough he's tried to be on China in his single term, and he also talked about China's economy will never surpass us. Tell us why U.S. politicians, are competing to be who is tougher on China? Is that a political correctness in Washington? And how do you look at, together we are going to have a new government in Washington. Any prediction of China-U.S. relationship would be like?
Of course, it's the political correctness right now in Washington to be tough or tougher on China. They are competing with who is the tougher guy on China. And for President Biden, he is talking about his legacy, right? And he says that actually he and his team think that his policy towards China is one of the successful policies of his administration. And because of the not a wrong strategic perception, there is a kind of a partisan consensus now in Washington that the U.S. needs to be tougher on its most important strategic competitor, which is China. And if we look into the future of our bilateral relation with the United States, I would say, I don't know whether cautiously optimistic is the right words to say my current attitudes toward this bilateral. Overall, I would say that bilateral relations will face a very difficult situation since the political correctness is still there in Washington, and I don't think that will go away in the near future. And but since the incoming U.S. president will have its plan, try to have some kind of deals with China, and possibly in the next 3 to 6 months, the bilateral relations will be okay. But then we will have the midterm election next year in the United States, and something will happen certainly after that election. But it's important for us to know that within the Trump team, there is several groups which have very different views regarding this bilateral relationship. So they are competing with each other, try to influence their policy.
Mm-hmm. So Baocheng, what should China do probably in order to, let's say, have a stable relationship or cooperative relationship with the U.S.? Briefly,
I think China should feel very proud when the U.S. named China as a strategic adversary or rivalry, because we used to be a subject of sympathy. And the U.S. did really help a lot for China to fight against the Japanese invasion, to aid in Chinese construction of hospitals and bring up the higher level of education, etc. So we were subject of sympathy for many years. And now, we as a developing country, if we are named by the most advanced country, both technologically and militarily, and not to mention economically, as a strategic rivalry, I just feel that if I'm treated by Michael Tyson as a rivalry on the wrestling board, I would feel rather proud. And but the way to go is that okay, we have to accept the fact. And this is really the 21st century. Thucydides trap does not really apply to such a sort of situation, because people know better of each other. There's far less information asymmetry, and now people have far better knowledge with regard what is really lying ahead, either through competition or through confrontation or through cooperation.
Right. Well,
so,
we have to stop there, Professor Liu. With that, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.